Rob.
Hi, Anne. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Anne Klaeysen, and you are several things. You are the humanist chaplain, which is kind of the chaplain for atheists and agnostics, I guess, at NYU, and you also do the same thing at Columbia under technically a different title slightly, but same idea. And in addition to that, you are minister, if that's quite the right term, at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, which itself is kind of like a church except for the believing in God part. And one reason that's really interesting to me is that lately, in recent years, there have been a number of attempts to start what are called atheist churches or humanist churches, for example, the Sunday Assembly. And the Society for Ethical Culture was doing that before it was cool, or maybe back during the first wave of coolness. It's a quite august institution, right? And there are the equivalent in a number of cities.
Right. I wish there were more of us and more societies. But yes, we were founded in 1876 as a non-theistic religion of ethics. And the notion is, and you said this last night at your presentation about putting more emphasis on behavior than on belief, with the understanding that as human beings, we grow up believing all kinds of things within our families, within our tribe, within our town, our social circle. And there are many reasons for being taught those things, because often out of those beliefs comes the impetus to behave in moral ways. And that's what religion has done for many years, I think. It's not only explained sort of the wonders of the world, but it also has provided an ethical code. And I think, today we have science that explains so much, but maybe doesn't explain where we get our values, although there's certainly been a lot of work on that. But within an ethical community, we say, believe or disbelieve as you wish, but join us on the common ground of ethics, where we aspire to be better human beings and make the world a better place.
Right. So the bumper sticker slogan is "Deed above creed."
Yes, that's one of them. Yep.
And it's interesting because it kind of stands in stark contrast to the new atheists, the so-called new atheists, who believe that religious belief per se is this horrible thing that has to be stomped out. You're quite explicitly taking a different approach, just judging people by their behavior, not their beliefs. Right. The idea that, of course, except for explicitly ethical beliefs, which tend to be closely correlated behavior with behavior, aside from those, religious beliefs can be compatible with good behavior, bad behavior, and it's the behavior you should focus on.
Sure. Well, I think the new atheists, and again, I don't like to lump them all together, but they've done that to themselves, so why not? The quotation that you showed at your presentation at UTS last night from Christopher Hitchens about Dr. Martin Luther King, I thought was so revealing, because he describes what King does, and then he says, but of course, I'm not quoting him exactly, but paraphrasing, but of course he's not a Christian. And, they do the same thing about religious humanists. Okay, well, you do these things, but it's not really religious. Well, why? Because they tell us so. And, religious humanists are believe in, well, let's say believe. We meet in congregations and communities because human beings need to do that. Mm-hmm. Tomorrow I'm doing a wedding. I've done one weekend, I did a baby naming, a wedding, and a memorial all in one weekend. Mm-hmm. No mention of God. The spirituality, if it were made explicit, was really about how wonderful to love one another and to have this connection and to make this commitment to be with each other. And that doesn't require a belief in God. So I think, I think where they are certainly not humble in their thinking is, and where they might have that cognitive bias, is that they don't know enough about religion. Mm-hmm. They assume it's something, and it's like a straw man in a philosophical, logical argument. They've created this straw man of religion, and then they're busy knocking it down without having any deep understanding of what religion is.
So the Martin Luther King quote was apparently an attempt to argue that, granted, Martin Luther King did good things in the name of religion, but since he wasn't really religious, according to Hitchens, that doesn't count as religion, an example of religion being good. And the argument was bizarre. He said because Martin Luther King did not threaten those who tormented him with eternal damnation in hell, he couldn't be a Christian because hell is a Christian doctrine. I mean, of course, turn the other cheek and love your enemy are also Christian doctrines. But in any event, that was a really strange piece of logic in his book, God is Not Great. But it's interesting. So you're saying that you get the same, or your movement gets the same thing from some new atheists for the same reason. That they don't want to, because they would admit that you're ethical people doing good, and you're saying they don't want to acknowledge that is religion doing good.
And I say that the one that David Silverman is, from American Atheists, is probably the most vociferous about this. And the few times when I've met him, well, difficult. I'm sorry, that's my email letting me know. Anyway, but the few times I've met him, he's really not interested in a conversation. But I understand that he has a role to play. And as a militant atheist, he's out there. He went to a CPAC conference and, so he's kind of out there in people's faces and he has a role to play. And that's fine, but acknowledge that I have a role to play too. And my congregation believes in being good without God. And we've been doing it since 1876.
Now, it's interesting. So you do consider yourself a religion. I would think that the new atheists aren't the only ones who would have a different view. I mean, a lot of people's conception of religion doesn't include a movement that makes no mention of a God or anything like a God, even, abstract words like the divine. I mean...
Yeah, even my own members have a problem with that. And I like to joke with them. I said, when we get really bored around here, we have a discussion about, is ethical culture a religion or isn't it? And when I know that when that conversation comes up, I go, oh, okay, we need to get to work on a social justice issue because they're getting bored. Because it's a non-issue in some ways, although it's a big issue to others. So our founder, Felix Adler, was pretty clear. He said, ethical culture is not my religion. Ethics is my religion. So the word ethical culture is to create a culture that supports and inspires ethical behavior. And so he said, in that community, there'll be people for whom it's a religion and there'll be people for whom it's not. And that's okay. How are we doing the work of the world? And so the work of the world included, founding different institutions like the visiting nurses or co-founding the ACLU or the NAACP, working against child labor, et cetera, et cetera. And his notion was that there would be a community that some people might be religious and some people might not, but again, the emphasis on the behavior. And I think, it's a kind of a creative tension in the movement, I think, whether or not it's a religion. And we like to joke and say the Unitarian Universalists ask, what do you believe? And ethical culture and religious humanists ask, how should I behave? So, and again, that's maybe too simple a distinction, but it shows you where our emphasis is. I mean, we can certainly talk about belief, from now until the cows come home, and it might be entertaining. But then what are we going to do with that? Where do we go from there?
Okay, so when Felix Adler kind of founded the movement, I'm curious, was there a concern on his part that without God, people would behave badly, which has been a traditional fear that I think is not as prominent as it was back in the Victorian age? Or was it partly a concern about image, that people will think, if we admit that we don't believe in God, they'll think we're bad people unless we get together and show them how good we can be? Do you have any idea what the mix of motivations was?
Yeah, well, Felix Adler was never an atheist. Okay. And he was an idealist philosopher, idealist with a capital I. In fact, he taught at Columbia for many years, and his son-in-law, Horace Free, started the religion department at Columbia. So his philosophy comes out of the transcendental movement. So for him, in other words, he doesn't believe in a supernatural, anthropomorphized deity at all. But he does believe in some ideal with a capital I, and he believes in a universal moral law that is transcendent and yet very real. So I think that's the distinction for him. And he wrote a book called An Ethical Philosophy of Life, in which different chapters refer to the philosophers who influenced him, like Emerson. He loved Ralph Waldo Emerson. In fact, he visited him and named his first child Waldo after Emerson. But what he didn't like about Emerson's philosophy in the Oversoul was that he felt that was kind of a unifying thing, that everyone should be part of a unity, whereas Adler's idealistic philosophy was emphasized more diversity, that it's important not that we all be one, but that we recognize and appreciate our unique differences. And indeed, the universe needs each one of those unique exertions upon it to be at its best. So a lot of the transcendentalist philosophy and notions, but a distinction between an oversoul being a unity and what he called an ethical manifold, which is much more diverse. Now, I have to tell you that most people who joined ethical culture did not necessarily buy into his philosophy, but they certainly liked the way that he put it into practice.
Now, when you say he was an idealist, you don't mean he, like Berkeley, believed that the physical universe didn't actually exist, right, or whatever it is Berkeley believed. You don't mean idealist in that sense.
No. It was more in terms of values to him. For example, honesty, integrity, love. Those kinds of things, and again, the universal moral law. He started off being trained to be a rabbi and take his father's place at Temple Emmanuel, which is right across Central Park from us. And in fact, the whole family came over. Adler was born in 1851, and in 56, they were already in New York, and his father Samuel was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. So, what often happens in families, his older brother went to Heidelberg to become a doctor, and he goes to Berlin to study to be a rabbi. But while he was there, typical, I don't know if you went through this, but I did, freshman year of college, all these different ideas come at me, and I'm experiencing cognitive dissonance, and he did too. And he said, if we're looking at the text, and we know, especially since he was studying in Germany, and literary and biblical criticism, they're applying it to sacred texts, and realizing that a number of people were responsible for writing the Torah, and that the kind of the history of it was collecting all this literature for people living in exile to hold them together. So that's a beautiful story in and of itself. But he's realizing that, it's not literally true. But there's a lot of wisdom here. And if that's the case, then upon what do I ground my sense of morality and ethics? And that's when he started reading philosophy. And he started reading Immanuel Kant, loved the categorical imperative, wrote home about it. His mother said, enough of the philosophy, no good will ever come of it. Come home and take your place at your father's pulpit. And he did. And he gave a sermon about Judaism of the future, which he imagined as holding that tribalism more loosely and then embracing the ethics of humanity. And the story goes that the trustees thought it was brilliant, but they had taken Judaism as far as they could go in the reform movement and weren't going to go any further. So as a result, some of the people who liked him and heard him and liked him, got him a gig at Standard Hall and then later at Carnegie Hall to give a series of lectures, and that became the beginning of ethical culture.
Okay. So your congregation, as a technical matter, you would welcome people of any religious persuasion in addition to atheists and agnostics, but I take it as a practical matter, your congregation consists mainly of atheists and agnostics?
I would say so. We do not require a conversion process. And I'm familiar with that because my father, who was Dutch Reformed, converted to Catholicism when he married my mother, because the children would have had to have been raised Catholic. But we don't do that. So we actually do have some people who continue to go to a temple or to a church. And very often they do that around the holidays. It's kind of something they grew up with. It's a tradition for them. But I would say that for the most part, atheists, agnostics, yeah.
Okay. And a lot of atheists and agnostics just don't feel the need for that kind of thing. So
exactly.
Is it possible to generalize about the kinds of people who are drawn into a congregation like yours? Why they feel the pull?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they feel the pull towards a community, and the sense that, whether it's a parent with children, or it's an older person, somebody who's recently widowed, for example, there are different times in a person's life when they feel the tug towards community, and and they might. And what's good about this community is, I often say that you can bring your whole self through the door. When I would go back and visit my parents and go back to the church where I was baptized, I needed to check a whole lot of myself at the door so that I could be civil. I would go in and listen to the homily and everything. But here, one takes one's whole self through. And that's what I hear over and over again. Partly they say, I like to be with like-minded people. And I think that's fine, but I also remind them, well, if you're saying like-minded, does that mean that that a Republican wouldn't feel comfortable here? And is that really the kind of community that we would want to be? I think we should look more at how could we be like-hearted people. But the fact is that they love to talk. We're like the opposite of Quakers. We talk all the time. And I think they're looking for a community where where they can. I'm sorry about that loud noise. I don't know how I can mute that and still.
That's
okay. Anyway, so so whether it's a parent, with a child wanting to participate in the Ethics for Children's program, or an older person empowering ethical elders so they can maintain their independence. People who want, we just heard, of course, about the paid family leave and raising the minimum wage, and we were all rejoicing because that's one of the social justice issues that we've been working on. So a lot of different things will draw people, but I think once they get here, there's just there's a social connection, because if people don't make a social connection, they don't stay, and so people care about one another. I just took lunch to one of my members who's feeling kind of heartbroken because one of her friends who has Alzheimer has had to move closer to her daughter, and she's missing her. So, we take care of one another.
Okay. Now, I mentioned that there are a number of recent attempts to start something kind of like, your group. The Sunday Assembly is pretty well known. I think you're on the board of the New York Sunday Assembly. What's your sense, first of all, is Sunday Assembly the main one you think of? Are there others? And what's your sense for how it's kind of going, whether these things are picking up momentum?
Right. Well, there are others. It's one of many. Sunday Assembly was started a few years ago by Sanderson Jones and Pippa Evans. And they are two comedians from the UK and London. And, they had a notion, they said they were talking to each other, remembering what fun they had in church, and wouldn't it be nice to have a church without God? And so they thought they were inventing it. They didn't realize there were already quite a number of communities already, but that's fine. They wanted to bring sort of more fun and more joy to it. So they started with a splash. In fact, we hosted the first one in the United States. I'm guessing maybe 3 years ago in our auditorium, and they got a big pull together. But I think soon after founding it, they suffered a little from founder's complex, because as charismatic as Sanderson Jones is, he himself will admit he's not a very good organizer. And so different things started across the country, across the world, and with a particular format. And so it's about, expressing joy and wonder and awe, and there's a different format to it that's not unlike what we do on a Sunday morning. So they have been meeting here on first Sunday afternoons here at the Ethical Society. Except the last few months, their attendance has dropped off a lot. And I understand that that's happening in other places as well. And we on the board have been trying to figure out what's going on. And we think that what's happening is the way it was originally set up, it was like put on a show. And so you had musicians, you were singing, you had people coming in answering what I did well today. And there was a certain format, but there was nothing that held people together after the show was over. And so trying to find volunteers to continue putting on the show proved difficult. And the group here wanted to use live music. Other places do not, like the one in Cambridge doesn't, for example. So they're going. We're going. In fact, we have a board meeting on Monday to try to figure out, where do we go from here. And one of the board members, he was at your presentation last night, Adam Gunnerman, is looking at it from sort of the social justice perspective. What can we do in terms of community service and social justice, building community around that, and sort of making that a feature of Sunday Assembly. I don't know whether other Sunday assemblies are doing that.
So that would be kind of comparable to the charitable work that some churches do.
Yeah, I think it would be, and I think it's a way of taking it beyond socializing. In other words, they do, some of them do socialize. In fact, there's another group here called the Gotham Atheists. New York City has a few atheist groups because they often don't get along with one another. So in fact, there was a schism early on here in New York, and Sanderson Jones sort of gave his blessing to Sunday Assembly, and then the was it revivalist, godless revival movement started, and they meet in local bars, which is not really conducive, is not really family friendly. So
yeah. Now, was that? I gather. I don't think this is the same thing you're talking about. Maybe you are. I heard that there was a split within the Sunday Assembly early on. There was dissension over the very question we discussed, which is that should this be a place for atheists only, or should we say everyone's welcome? This just isn't about God. And in the end, the latter group, I think, won out, and that is the character of Sunday Assembly, that it's inclusive. Right, but that was a big kind of fork in the road they went through.
Well, it was, and it happened early on. Actually, the New York Society was involved in that somewhat peripherally. I wasn't on the Sunday Assembly board at that time, but I had offered them space here, and it was a natural fit, because the original Sunday Assembly in London meets at the Ethical Culture Society at Conway Hall in London. So it was a natural fit, and Sanderson Jones and Pippa Evans agreed. So using the society as the venue was a bone of contention at the very beginning. So I was sort of peripheral to that, what was going on at that time, but that was a big deal because the New York City atheists did not want to meet here. They had a particular animus against a group that calls itself a religion.
Well, the decision to put kind of social justice or charitable work or whatever at the heart of it is an interesting one, because it's certainly not all the case that by any means, that during the heyday of kind of conventional churches, that was the reason people were going to church. I mean, I remember, we when I was young, Southern Baptist, my parents would give a percentage of their income to the church. The idea was some of that was going to charitable service, but that wasn't what church membership was mainly about. And there's a lot of people who would get benefits, psychological benefits out of going to church, who wouldn't be up for doing a whole lot of actual work in the streets, right?
No, absolutely. And, at the end of the 19th century, ethical culture was one of many groups, religious groups, in the social gospel movement. So there was quite a bit of activity within Christian churches to actualize Christianity through charitable work. So you're right. I mean, it hasn't always been the centerpiece of their theology, but at different times in their history, the evolution of theology and the evolution of church polity is interesting. So, there was a great deal of need, particularly in New York City at the end of the 19th century. We didn't have, the government organizations that could provide to people in need and all the immigrants coming in. So there was a big social gospel movement, and we were, in a sense, a part of that in as much as we, joined those efforts. And I think, one of the distinctions is that we were very involved in the settlement house movement. Jane Addams was an ethical culture lecturer in Chicago and started Hull House. And you probably brought into Hull House many professors from the University of Chicago, including John Dewey, who then came to Columbia. His children were at the Ethical Culture School, and he and Felix Adler knew each other well. Differed somewhat on their pedagogical philosophy, but, got along well enough. And then here, Hudson Guild in Chelsea was started by ethical culture leader John Lovejoy Elliott. So I think, the way that we looked at social gospel, if you will, or social justice was not in promoting our particular philosophy or religion, but in saying, how can we be good neighbors to you? How can we help to empower you? And so that settlement house philosophy was very much a part of how we do social justice, which is very different from philanthropic and charitable work that was primarily, I think, done by Christian and Jewish organizations.
Okay.
And
now,
that's a gross generalization, but
are there particular humanist churches, or maybe particular chapters of humanist churches, like chapters of Sunday Assembly, that are doing really well, and you kind of think you know what they're doing right?
Yeah. Well, we're always trying to figure that out. Certainly, the Washington Ethical Society in the D.C. area is doing very well, and they're growing. They have also dual affiliated with the American Ethical Union, our national organization, and the Unitarian Universalists. I think the biggest society we have in terms of membership is in St. Louis. It's in Clayton, and they've been very involved with what's going on in Ferguson. In fact, they've been hosting a number of events there, and also, working with the police department and hosting events there in terms of Ferguson. We also have in the metropolitan New York area, we have several, and then we're also closely related to the Secular American Humanist Association. Roy Speckert is the director there, and he is also on the board of the Humanist Institute, and I'm the co-dean of that. So there's a lot of humanist groups and organizations and individuals are very connected to one another, and we all know each other fairly well, and express our humanism in different ways. So I think more of the local AHA, American Humanist Association chapters, albeit secular, are providing a lot of that community that people are looking for, and they're doing that more and more, whether it's through a potluck or socializing in some way, working on projects together. A lot of us are involved in the upcoming Democracy Spring, and that's been pulling a lot of us together, because although we absolutely support separation of church and state, we also believe that it's important to have a well-educated and participatory democracy. So we've been involved in that. And our national group will also have a table at the June 4th Reason Rally in D.C. So, and then we're also, the New York Society is part of a Reasonable New York coalition that involves the secular humanists, the Brights. I'm forgetting who else now, but you can check these.
Wait, are Wrights still around? I thought that term fell flat on its face after Dan Dennett proposed it in an op-ed, because it seemed to confirm, the worst stereotypes about maybe in particular the new atheists, but it sounded like they thought they were smarter than everyone else.
Yeah. I don't think it's as big as it was, and it certainly is disparate. I mean, I think, and again, this is just my sense, that they're not very communal and community-oriented. They really are more in touch online, so they're not as cohesive, say, as other groups are. But they're they're out there.
Can you describe a service, a Sunday service, and tell us, what does it have in common with a conventional church, and how is it different?
Yeah, well, the first thing it has in common is that we take a collection.
Good idea.
Like some people, when they pass the basket, go, "Oh, it's just like a church." But I can say the distinction is that we split the collection 50-50. And I always say half goes to keep the roof over our heads, the other half keeps the roof over another nonprofit organization's head. So, and we try to do that locally. And we also try to find a theme. So, for example, in February, all of our shared charity went to the local sickle cell anemia organization. And not only because of February being Black History Month, but also because our facilities manager, Leo Gibson, whom we love very much, lost one brother to sickle cell and is dealing with another one who's suffering from it. So it was very personal to us, and we made sure that every Sunday in the month of February we donated. This month, in April, we're going to be donating to local immigration groups, because we feel it's really important to, to not separate families, to not. And I think, I love Obama, but he's implemented this policy more than other presidents in terms of really dividing families and deporting them and things like that. I think so at any rate, so we're very concerned about that. So that's the collection, which I think every church or synagogue does. But somebody will welcome people. We'll have music. We have a music director.
You have music in the sense of, do you sing songs as a congregation?
We do, yeah.
What kinds of songs? What is your hymnal?
Okay. I don't have it handy now. But we take some music from the last time that we published one recently. I don't have a copy handy, but sometimes it's folk music, sometimes it's social justice songs.
So, like Blowing in the Wind or what?
Exactly. We love Bob Dylan. Yeah.
Do you not use any songs with references to God, or could you sing "Kumbaya, Lord"?
Yeah, well, we don't. I mean, Kumbaya is such a cliche that we don't sing that now. But we do change. We're not adverse to changing wording. So, and the joke is that you need to have a chorus so you can start in the first measure, because everybody else is reading ahead to see if they agree with the words. So there is a lot of vetting of the lyrics in there. But it could also be something like, Louis Armstrong. It's singing, "What a Wonderful Life." So our music director looks at what the topic is for the day, and works with the choral director to find something that would be appropriate and something that would be easy for our membership to sing. So it's not a performing chorus that we have. It's really one that sort of leads people in singing. But we also have instrumental music as well, so we sort of start with the instrumental music, and then the presider will ask David, our music director, to come up and ask him, well, how did you come to select this music, and what is it that you thought would connect with the topic? We also have opening words from our children. I might read a story to them, and then on the first community song, the children will sing them out, and then they go upstairs to their Ethics for Children class. And then, of course, we sort of let people know in your program. On the front, you'll see a description of the society and its mission. And the presider will then give something personal, why I enjoy presiding today, and why I'm a member of this community, and what's important about it to me. And then we will sort of greet one another. This is where my husband always walks out the door. I'm not turning and greeting somebody, but we'll have a question involved. And so rather than just saying good morning and not knowing what else to say, we will have offer a question about the particular program. This Sunday, I'm going to be celebrating April is Poetry Month, and we'll be doing the ethics of poetry. And so your daughter's a poet, right?
Yes, I would call her one. Yes, both daughters in a sense, but one's still in college. The other is pursuing an MFA. If
they're around on Sunday, when I do the Poetry Month, I just have a lot of poems folded up in different colors. People reach into the bag, pull out a handful, and as I get to a particular aspect of poetry, like it might be that good poetry will inspire us to feel empathy for someone in a position that we may not be familiar with. And I'll read an example, and I'll say, does anybody else have an example? And then they'll read from one of the poems they pulled out. So very participatory. But usually it's a lecture. My colleagues and I often give lectures, but every once in a while it's good to mix it up, to interview someone, for example, rather than just be a talking head, or festivals. We do seasonal festivals as well.
Okay.
So, and then when that part is finished, then we do announcements and the collection and sing another song, closing words, and then we go to lunch together.
Okay. So there are, one thing ministers do is pastoral care when people in the congregation have problems, illness, death, they lose a job. There are kinds of consolation that are maybe easier to provide if you believe in a God. Of course, there are also kinds of questions that are harder to answer, like why did this bad thing happen to me, maybe. But still, in the cases of death and so on, there are kinds of consolation that are maybe easier for a Christian minister than for you. What are some of the challenges you think you face that are peculiar to your endeavor as a humanist church, and how do you handle them?
I don't find those kinds of challenges because, the role of a chaplain is to connect to whoever is in front of us. So if I have someone in front of me who believes in God and for whom that God image is important, then I'm going to listen to that. And I'm going to wonder in what ways that belief supports this person in whatever journey they're on. Mm-hmm. But mostly I'm with someone who does not believe in God and is very realistic about what's happening. And in that case, again, it's about, to me, spirituality is about the connections that we have to others and what kind of inner resources do we have. So I want to understand when I'm sitting down with someone, what kind of inner resources do they have? What kind of connections do they have? How are they finding meaning in their lives? So when I told you before that I went to visit someone today, a lot of the meaning for her has been this friendship that she's had with someone who has Alzheimer's and is now sort of being removed from where she's lived for so long to be closer to her daughter. But in so doing, it's a kind of a grief for those who have been friends with her. So I think, a lot of it is, most of it's listening. 99% of it is listening. And when I got my doctorate of ministry, one of my professors said, when you sit down with somebody, the first 20 minutes belongs to that person. And you're listening. And you're listening for where and how it pinches. And so then at the end of the 20 minutes, you sort of take a breath and say, may I reflect back what I heard you say? And I'm wondering about this or about that. And so, but any good chaplain, no matter what the faith background, should be trained to do that.
Now, I spoke at a Sunday assembly in San Jose, California, not long ago. And it was a good crowd, 80 to 100 people, I guess. I was the guest sermon, so to speak, except it wasn't secular. But it reminded me demographically a little bit of a Unitarian church. And I would imagine in terms of belief there was a pretty close correspondence because I think your average Unitarian doesn't actually believe in God in the sense in which your average Christian means God, but also, I would say one thing I've noticed at both kinds of places is kind of an older demographic. Mm-hmm. And now that's also a challenge that maybe some mainline churches face, but there are also churches, maybe evangelical churches and so on, that have an appreciably younger demographic than some of these humanist churches I've seen, and then the UUs, the Unitarians congregations that I've seen. So is this an issue you face, and if so, what are you doing about it?
Yeah, it's a big challenge for us and the younger generation, the millennials, the Gen Zs. It's a real challenge, and that's one of the reasons I'm happy to be on college campuses, NYU and Columbia, because they're not getting up in the morning and coming into the society or a UU church. I mean, they're just not doing that, and so the challenge is how do we meet people where they are. And so that's why I really love the work that I do on campuses, because I meet them where they are. And of course, the invitation is always open, to come to the society, and sometimes some of them do. But it's a real challenge for the stalwarts, the older generation, who get a little anxious, about whether the society will continue and have to recognize that it will be taking different forms. There's also something called Oasis, and they also get together a lot, and they're growing. And I think that's a good thing. So I think, reaching out and understanding that we all need to connect as organizations together, and not, as one of my colleagues said, we can't purify ourselves out of existence. So in other words, we do need to be much more open in terms of the modality in which we make our presentations, the vocabulary that we use. I love to look at the Pew Forum to see what's happening there. And they came up with the SBNR, spiritual but not religious, and the nuns, NONES. And so that's a very interesting thing to be looking at. And I like what you're doing too, because I think we're doing a lot of this in terms of humanist spirituality. There is a sense of mindfulness How do we? In other words, ethical culture was always from its founding informed by science, and so that's very important to us. And I think what I have been looking at lately is the work being done on, like Dan Siegel on Mindsight and the mind-body dilemma, all of that, and saying, well, it's making sense now, in terms of mindfulness practices among Buddhists, for example, which is also a non-theistic religion of ethics. And we have a lot in common there. So I think it kind of somehow it's all coming together for people, I think, in that spiritual but not religious. But I think what they mean by religious is they don't like the institution. They say the institutions are hypocritical, whether they're misogynists or homophobes or whatever, that they find the institutions hypocritical, and so they're looking more for something spiritual that does not have that overlay of history to it. I'm very encouraged.
You mentioned Oasis, this movement, I guess kind of a network now of humanist churches. That's interesting. I mean, first of all, I actually had a kind of an interaction, I think, with the guy who I think is the founder. Is his last name Aun or A-U-N or something like that? Is that right?
No, I'm sorry. I'm not that familiar with it.
This is back when he was, I happened to be on a TV show with him back when he was coming out of the closet. He had been a minister. And he was coming out of the closet as an atheist or agnostic or whatever it was. And I asked him on the TV show, are you going to do anything, try to do anything with like a congregation under this new, the belief system he's now professing? And we got into an email exchange. He's wound up doing it. And I think that was the beginning of Oasis. And I recently read that a church, an actual Christian church, I think it was in Canada, has moved onto the Oasis platform. In other words, like collectively, they've said, okay, we're not really Christians. But anyway, the question I'm asking is this a specific kind of niche within the humanist church movement, which is to say people who have just lost their faith and are looking for some... I know there's a podcast called Life After God, which caters to those kinds of people. And I would guess that Oasis... draws on that kind of demographic a little, and I would think that that's that those are people who've been going to church all their life, and suddenly they realize they don't belong there, would maybe be more strongly motivated to find something church-like than your average humanist.
I don't know if it's all of a sudden either. I mean, I think people go through a long process. I think there are a lot of atheists sitting in the pews of churches and synagogues and in mosques, and they stay there for many different reasons. And it could be, social pressure. It could be because, if you live in a small town and you don't belong to a church, you're not going to sell many used cars or many insurance policies because you're sort of required to do that. So I think there are many people, and Daniel Dennett has this wonderful clergy project, where he reaches out to clergy who are no longer believing, and yet how do they get out? And they're feeling like hypocrites. They're feeling like they're letting their congregants down, and yet they just don't have that belief anymore. So I don't think it's like, an epiphany, or something that happens suddenly. I think it happens over time, and then finally somebody says, you know what? I'm just tired, and I just want to be with other people who feel and believe the same way I do. I don't know a great deal about Oasis, and I want to learn more. Jerry DeWitt is someone who, in Louisiana, who got a lot of attention, and there was a CNN program about atheism, and he was highlighted in that. And he was an evangelical preacher and said, I really don't believe anymore, slowly came out to people, suffered the consequences of that. And then started his own, organization where people come and do pretty much what he was doing before, except without the God talk. Mm-hmm. So I think there are more and more of those that are starting, and I think the internet has helped a lot with that, because people go online and they're going, I'm feeling this way, I'm thinking this way, I'm not finding any support. Oh my gosh, there are other people who think the way I do, and how can I get in touch with them? And also not to forget the humanist Jews who started out, a few years ago in Birmingham, Michigan, and sadly Sherwin Wine died a few years ago, but colleague at Harvard, Greg Epstein, is a humanist rabbi and has a community at Harvard and the humanist hub there. So there's a lot of different iterations and different models of it, and we're trying to network more.
Mm-hmm. I would think the internet has also been a challenge because, for young people, socializing doesn't necessarily mean getting together. I mean, you're involved in trying to get people together in a physical space every Sunday. And when I grew up, that was the only way to socialize. But for, college students today, and you have a lot of contact with them, they do so much socializing online that it's not like they wake up with this thirst, So,
no, it's true. Yeah, and there's the Secular Student Alliance that helps a lot with that. In fact, the NYU group has affiliated with them, and so they get a lot of information, a lot of materials from the Secular Student Alliance, and a lot of that is done online. Young folks they've got a lot on their plates, and a lot of stress also academically, and we just hope that we reach out in some way. Some of them are, as you know, are kind of new atheist oriented.
Yeah.
But others, I think, are seeing, to me, and I feel like I'm a student of John Dewey and pragmatism. I like to be very, pragmatic about that, and I know that my behavior has consequences. So even if I may feel that someone's an idiot, I'm not going to say that, and I'm going to sort of wonder about, what's going on and how can I have a relationship? I think I mentioned to you before that one of the chapters in Adler's book on forgiveness, he has a very long footnote on intellectual enemies. And those are the people whose beliefs, were they to become prevalent, we would find it difficult to breathe the very air, because it would be so antithetical to our own values and our own considerations. He said, but even they hold a piece of the truth. Now, that's a lot to ask, but I think that's calling upon us to behave in an ethical way, to take seriously that ethical choice to attribute worth and dignity to every human being.
Uh-huh. So I gather, I would imagine that a university chaplain would do pastoral care sometimes. I mean, I would imagine that a traditional university chaplain, it might be a Christian student coming to a Christian chaplain with a personal problem or a philosophical problem or whatever. Does that happen much for a humanist chaplain?
Yeah, and it's interesting. More often than not, I will get someone who was raised in a traditionally religious home who is having some doubts and will come to me before they open up to their parents. Mm-hmm. And so, and I don't know whether they're expecting me to cheer them on or not, but what I do is I ask them, what is it still about the faith in which you were raised that you hold dear? What is it that you still hold on to that's important to you? And what is it about it that you feel you need to walk away from, you need to leave? And then I'm always impressed that they want to talk to their parents about it, but they're worried about that too, and wondering how best to do that. And so I often see them right before a break, right before Thanksgiving or spring break or summer, they'll come in and talk to me about it. One fellow has a dual problem because he is both wanting to leave a very orthodox Catholic faith, with which I was unfamiliar because my Catholicism was not that rigid, and he's also gay. So he's sort of saying, well, I think I'll deal with the religion piece first, and I've already invented a girlfriend to deal with the other. So, obviously there's more going on there. It's never simply, I shouldn't say never, but it's usually not simply a matter of the religion. There's some dynamic and some relationship. And so again, I'm there, to listen and also to wonder with them, what might be unraveling for them, what might be happening. So,
so a lot of your kind of counseling is about the question of religious belief. Do you also get many cases of students who just are atheists or agnostics and have some personal problem, or would they be more likely to seek counseling elsewhere?
Well, it's interesting. It's funny. I think For atheists and agnostics, they're very well educated and knowledgeable, and so they probably, and many of them are already in therapy. Certainly in my congregation here, there are some therapists who are members and they've been in therapy. So one challenge I've had is to sort of let my members know, and also students, that pastoral counseling is a little different. In other words, I'm not doing therapy with them, although I have the training sort of intuit or understand what's going on and am able to refer them to people. But I think mostly I'm a sounding board for how their beliefs inform their life, how their unbeliefs inform their lives. What kind of relationships. I mean, for example, an atheist dating an evangelical Christian. There's a strong sexual attraction. But how are they gonna navigate that? How's that going to work out for them? Because there are challenges there. So yeah, it's all about how do we get along with each other? How do we relate? And I think so much of the ethics of identity. I went to hear Kwame Anthony Appiah down at NYU a few weeks ago, and he was discussing cosmopolitanism with a Christian professor. Kind of interesting that. And, it's about a lot of what he talks about is that identity. And I think that faith, religion is a very strong identification, is a very strong label that we grow up with. And so you're not just leaving a religion, you're kind of, breaking out of a cocoon, if you will, or, changing your identity. On the other hand, there are a lot of kids, who didn't grow up with any religion at all. Wedding couples that I see, maybe their parents and grandparents had some tradition, but they really don't have anything. So sometimes we get people who grew up with nothing and think they're missing out on something, but they don't want to go all the way to a God belief. So they check us out for that reason, too.
Okay. So we said that a number of the kind of newer humanist churches some of them are struggling. But on balance, looking back over the last 30 years, and also some of the traditional humanist churches are struggling, I should add. But looking back over the last 30 years, say, if you add it all up, Ethical Culture Society, Oasis, Sunday Assembly, things in this space, is total membership kind of clearly growing or not?
Yes, but we're talking about people who are non-joiners. So are they signing on the dotted line necessarily? Are they making financial contributions? Maybe not, but I think that they certainly, come and they know about us and like to know that we're there. We're not, I think we struggle sometimes financially because non-joiners don't tithe. And so we find we're in a position of renting our space out to more traditional Christian churches because they're able to afford it more than we are. So there are some challenges around that. And also someone who's, progressive or liberal is also going to belong to the ACLU, the Sierra Club. They're going to be involved in environmental issues. They're not going to put all their eggs in one basket the way an evangelical Christian Orthodox Jew might do. So I think that's a consideration as well. But I think the movement overall is growing because it's reasonable, it's rational. Although sometimes that can be an impediment. I grew up in Palmyra, the birthplace of Mormonism. It's got to be the most, to me, it's a cosmology more than a theology, and yet millions of adherents to this. So maybe reason and rationality isn't the greatest draw.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Ann. I will be speaking at a Sunday service at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. I think it's in May. I'm not sure, but
June 19th.
June,
Sunday,
good. Okay, so I've got time to actually prepare something. Excellent. So, but in any event, I'll get to see some of this firsthand, and I'm looking forward to it. So keep up the good work, meanwhile. I'll see you then.
Okay. Thank you. This is a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So long.